The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the county courthouse as Sarah Mitchell sat in the waiting area, her fingers unconsciously picking at the hem of her navy blue dress. She had chosen the outfit carefully, professional yet not intimidating, clean but not ostentatious. Everything about her appearance today was calculated, curated for the judge's perception. At 28 years old, Sarah looked a decade older, her face etched with the exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept properly in months. She pulled out her phone and looked at the wallpaper one more time, a photograph of Emma laughing at the beach last summer before everything fell apart. Her 3-year-old daughter's joy radiated from the screen, those bright blue eyes that matched her own, that infectious smile that could light up any room. The image blurred as Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She quickly wiped them away, remembering her lawyer's strict instructions. No crying in court, no emotional outbursts, maintain composure at all times. "Sarah, it's time. We need to go in," a calm voice said beside her. It was Jennifer, her lawyer, a sharp woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and a reputation for winning tough custody cases. Jennifer had taken Sarah's case 6 months ago, back when everything felt impossible. She'd spent countless hours listening to Sarah's story, reviewing documentation, and preparing for this very moment. But even Jennifer's confidence had wavered over the past few weeks as the opposition's counterarguments mounted. Sarah stood on shaky legs, smoothing down her dress one more time. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear the blood rushing in her ears. This was it, the final hearing in what had become the most brutal experience of her life. 3 months of legal battles, court dates, psychological evaluations, home visits by social services, and endless questioning had led to this moment. Everything she'd fought for, everything she'd sacrificed, came down to what happened in the next few hours. As they walked down the hallway toward the courtroom, Sarah's mind raced back to how she'd gotten here. It seemed like a lifetime ago when she'd married David Mitchell at 23, starry-eyed and convinced they were meant for forever. David had been charming then, a successful pharmaceutical salesman with a promising career and a charismatic smile that made everyone around him feel comfortable. They'd bought a house in Green Hills, one of Nashville's most prestigious neighborhoods. They'd planned for children, renovated the kitchen together, dreamed big dreams. Then Emma was born, and everything changed. At first, Sarah attributed David's irritability to new parent stress. But as months passed, his behavior became increasingly erratic. He'd snap at Emma for crying, demand silence when she was playing, and grew angry when Sarah spent too much attention on their daughter instead of him. The drinking started subtly, a few beers after work, then more. By the time Emma turned 2, David's personality had transformed into something dark and unpredictable. There were nights when Sarah would lock herself and Emma in the bedroom, listening to him rage downstairs about things that didn't matter. There were mornings when she'd find him passed out on the couch, empty whiskey bottles lined up on the coffee table. The physical abuse had started without warning. A shove during an argument, a slap across her face when she questioned his spending. Nothing severe enough to leave lasting marks, but severe enough to terrify her. Severe enough that she knew she had to leave before it escalated. Severe enough that she feared for Emma's safety in ways she couldn't fully articulate. She'd left on a Tuesday in March, taking only what she and Emma could carry. She'd driven to her sister's house 3 hours away and never looked back. That's when David's true colors emerged. Instead of accepting the separation, he'd immediately filed for custody, claiming Sarah was unstable and an unfit mother. He'd hired an expensive lawyer and used his charm to convince everyone who would listen that Sarah was the villain in their story. Now, as she and Jennifer approached the courtroom doors, Sarah could see David through the glass partition. He sat at the opposing counsel's table, dressed in an expensive suit, his dark hair perfectly styled, his expression one of concerned sincerity. To anyone who didn't know him, he looked like a devoted father fighting to see his daughter. But Sarah knew the truth behind those carefully constructed appearances. The courtroom itself was intimidating, high ceilings, dark wood paneling, and an imposing judge's bench that seemed designed to make ordinary people feel small. Judge, a stern-looking woman in her 60s who had a reputation for being fair but inflexible, sat reviewing case files. There were court reporters, bailiffs, and various court officials moving efficiently through the space. In the back row, separated by a guardian, sat Emma. Sarah's breath caught when she saw her daughter. Emma was so small, swallowed up by an oversized chair, her tiny legs swinging slightly as she looked around the unfamiliar environment with confusion and anxiety. She was wearing the pink dress Sarah had chosen for her, the one with the little flowers that Emma loved. The child's face was solemn, her expression far too serious for a 3-year-old. She didn't smile when she saw her mother. Instead, she looked frightened and uncertain. Sarah wanted to run to her daughter to scoop her up and tell her everything would be okay, but she remained in her seat, following Jennifer's earlier instructions. Show appropriate emotion, but don't be melodramatic. Be dignified. Let the evidence speak for itself. Judge called the court to order, and the gavel struck with a sound that seemed to reverberate through Sarah's chest. This was it, the custody battle that would determine whether Sarah got to keep her daughter or whether David would gain joint or full custody. The stakes were impossibly high. Sarah had documented incidents, diary entries, photographs of bruises she'd hidden from everyone's medical records, but David's lawyer had systematically worked to discredit everything. We're here to conclude the custody proceedings in the matter of David Mitchell versus Sarah Mitchell regarding the minor child, Emma Mitchell, Judge announced, her voice carrying no emotion whatsoever. Both parties have submitted their cases. Today, we'll hear final arguments before I make my determination. Sarah's lawyer squeezed her arm reassuringly, but it did little to calm the storm of anxiety churning inside her. Jennifer had prepared her well, but nothing could truly prepare you for this, for the possibility that you might lose custody of your own child to someone you feared. David's lawyer stood first, presenting arguments that painted Sarah as emotionally unstable, a woman trying to alienate a father from his daughter, a vindictive ex-wife making false accusations. The lawyer presented character witnesses, David's colleagues, friends, even his brother, all vouching for his character and fitness as a parent. No mention of the drinking, no acknowledgement of the anger, just a carefully constructed narrative of a good man wronged by a vengeful ex-partner. Then it was Sarah's turn. Jennifer presented the documentation, the timeline, the pattern of behavior, but without concrete evidence of abuse involving Emma specifically, without the child's own testimony, which everyone agreed a 3-year-old couldn't provide reliably. The judge seemed unimpressed. As Sarah took the witness stand for what felt like the 100th time and answered the same questions over and over, she could feel the judge's skepticism. Without Emma's voice, without something definitive, this case felt like it was slipping away. Sarah's hands trembled as she spoke about her fears, her experiences, her desperate need to protect her daughter. And then the judge glanced at the clock. The final hearing was drawing to a close without resolution, without any breakthrough that might change her mind. The clock on the courtroom wall showed 2:47 p.m. when Judge made an announcement that caught everyone off guard. She had been reviewing notes from the social services evaluation, and her expression shifted slightly, not quite friendliness, but a softening of her usual rigid demeanor. Before we conclude, there's a matter I'd like to address, Judge said, setting down her papers. I've been made aware that we have a certified emotional support animal available in the courthouse today. Given the presence of a minor child in these proceedings, and considering the sensitive nature of this case, I'm going to approve a request that was submitted by Ms. Mitchell's legal team. Sarah's eyes widened. She glanced at Jennifer, who gave her a subtle nod. Jennifer had mentioned this possibility weeks ago, but Sarah had almost forgotten about it amid all the stress and chaos. It had seemed like such a long shot, such an unconventional request, that she'd pushed the idea to the back of her mind. The bailiff nodded and disappeared through a side door. A few moments later, the door opened again, an officer walked into the courtroom, leading one of the most beautiful dogs Sarah had ever seen. Officer was a man in his early 40s, with kind eyes and a calm demeanor that immediately put people at ease. He'd been a police officer for 18 years, and for the last 5, he'd been part of the Nashville Police Department's Community Support Animal program. He wore his uniform with quiet dignity, and his presence commanded respect without demanding it. But it was the dog beside him that captured everyone's attention. Duke was a golden retriever, approximately 7 years old, with a coat the color of honey that seemed to glow under the fluorescent courtroom lights. His build was strong and athletic, but his expression was gentle and wise, as if he'd seen enough of the world's pain to understand it deeply. Duke moved with practiced grace, his movements precise and controlled, each step purposeful. He wore a special harness that identified him as a certified emotional support animal, complete with official patches and credentials. Officer guided Duke slowly into the courtroom, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had done this many times before. As they walked, Officer made brief eye contact with the judge, silently communicating his understanding of the gravity of the moment. Judge watched them approach with an expression of cautious approval. "This is Officer and Duke, our certified emotional support animal," Judge announced to the courtroom. "Duke has been specially trained to provide emotional comfort and support in sensitive legal proceedings. He has been instrumental in helping traumatized children and witnesses find courage to speak their truth. I'm approving his presence in this courtroom for the remainder of today's proceedings." David's lawyer stood abruptly, clearly ready to object, but Judge raised her hand. "I've reviewed the relevant case law, and emotional support animals are well established in family court proceedings. Duke will remain." Officer guided Duke to a position near the witness stand, settling the dog into a calm, alert position. Duke sat perfectly still, his back straight, his brown eyes taking in the courtroom with intelligent awareness. Despite his calm exterior, Duke seemed to understand that this was an important moment. This was serious work. Sarah watched as the courtroom adjusted to Duke's presence. The tension that had been suffocating the room seemed to lighten slightly. Even the court reporters, usually so businesslike and detached, seemed to relax a bit. There was something about Duke's presence that was inherently calming, a reminder that compassion existed even in spaces designed for conflict and judgment. But it was Emma's reaction that truly mattered. The 3-year-old had been sitting quietly, almost motionless in her seat in the back of the courtroom. She'd been withdrawn and anxious all day, overwhelmed by the unfamiliar environment, the raised voices, the tension that permeated every interaction. Her small frame had seemed to shrink further as the morning and afternoon wore on. The court-appointed guardian beside her, a woman named Mrs. Hayes, had been monitoring Emma carefully, nodding her increasing anxiety with each passing hour. When Duke entered the courtroom, everything changed. Emma's head lifted. Her eyes, which had been downcast and sad, suddenly focused with intense interest. She watched Duke intently as Officer guided him to his position. Her tiny hands, which had been fidgeting anxiously with the hem of her dress, went still. Her breathing, which Sarah could somehow sense had been shallow and rapid, seemed to deepen. For the first time since arriving at the courthouse that morning, Emma smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed her small face and revealed the joyful child Sarah knew her daughter to be. It was the smile of recognition, the smile of hope. Emma leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Duke. She looked at Mrs. Hayes with a question in her expression. The court-appointed guardian, sensing the shift in the child's emotional state, leaned down and whispered something to Emma. Sarah couldn't hear the words, but she could see Emma nod eagerly, her whole body suddenly animated with interest. Sarah felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. This was the Emma she knew. This was her daughter, curious, engaged, open to the world. Not this frightened, withdrawn child who had been present in the courtroom all day. The difference was staggering, almost shocking in its intensity. Officer seemed to notice Emma's interest as well. He made eye contact with Mrs. Hayes and gave a subtle nod. The guardian understood. Duke's presence had somehow shifted Emma's emotional state, and that shift was already providing valuable information about the child's and comfort. Judge observed the entire exchange with keen attention. She watched as Emma's posture changed, as the child became more present and engaged. There was a flicker of something in the judge's expression, recognition, perhaps, of what she was witnessing. This was what the case had been missing. This was what no testimony or documentation could quite capture, a child's unfiltered emotional response to safety and comfort. "I think we should take a brief recess," Judge announced. "Let's reconvene in 20 minutes. Officer, would you be able to remain with Duke during the break, perhaps in the waiting area in case the child would like to interact with him?" It was phrased as a question, but it was clearly a directive. Officer nodded respectfully. "Of course, Your Honor, that's exactly what I'm here for." David's lawyer looked frustrated but said nothing. David himself seemed annoyed, his carefully constructed expression of concern slipping for just a moment to reveal something darker underneath. He didn't like this development. He hadn't anticipated this complication to his carefully planned narrative. As the bailiff called for the recess and people began to stand and move about the courtroom, Sarah watched as Mrs. Hayes gently led Emma toward the waiting area where Officer and Duke had positioned themselves. She saw her daughter walk toward the dog with a child's pure, unguarded openness. She saw Officer smile warmly at Emma and gesture for her to sit beside Duke. And for the first time since this custody battle had begun, Sarah felt something shift inside her. It wasn't certainty. She was too experienced with disappointment to feel that. But it was something close to hope. Hope that Duke's presence might somehow bridge the gap that testimony and documents could not. Hope that her daughter's own reaction to safety and comfort might speak louder than all the accusations and counterarguments in the world. The recess had just begun, but Sarah already sensed that something momentous was about to happen in this case. Something that would change everything. When the courtroom reconvened at 3:10 p.m., the atmosphere had shifted subtly but significantly. Emma emerged from the waiting area holding onto Mrs. Hayes' hand, but her eyes were bright and alert, her shoulders less hunched than before. She'd spent the recess time sitting beside Duke, stroking his soft fur while Officer answered her quiet questions with patience and kindness. Though Emma hadn't spoken much, she rarely did in unfamiliar situations. Her body language had transformed. She seemed grounded, more present, as if the dog had anchored her to a sense of safety. Officer guided Duke back to his position near the witness stand, and Duke settled once more into his calm, alert posture. Judge surveyed the courtroom and nodded slightly, as if confirming that this was the right decision. "We're ready to proceed," Judge announced. "Ms. Mitchell, I'd like you to return to the witness stand. We still have some matters to address before I make my final ruling." Sarah rose on unsteady legs and made her way to the witness stand once more. This was her final opportunity to convince the judge that her fears were legitimate, that Emma's safety was genuinely at risk in her father's care. She'd rehearsed this testimony dozens of times with Jennifer, had practiced keeping her voice steady and her emotions controlled. But sitting under the bright lights, facing the judge's impassive expression and her ex-husband's confident smirk, Sarah felt the weight of it all pressing down on her shoulders. Jennifer stood and approached the witness stand. They'd choreographed this carefully, planning exactly which incidents Sarah should describe, which details would be most compelling to a judge who seemed skeptical of everything presented so far. "Sarah, I want to take you back to the incident from March 15th of this year," Jennifer began, her voice calm and measured. "Can you describe what happened that evening?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I was putting Emma to bed. David came home from work in a foul mood. I could smell alcohol on him, though it was only 6 o'clock in the evening. He started criticizing the way I'd cleaned the kitchen, saying I was incompetent and lazy. Emma heard him yelling and became frightened. She started crying, which made him angrier. He told me to shut that kid up, and when I tried to calm Emma down, he shoved me against the counter. Hard. I hit my shoulder blade against the edge. Did he directly harm Emma? Jennifer asked. Not physically, but... Just answer the question, Ms. Mitchell, David's lawyer interrupted, standing abruptly. Did he physically harm the child? No, Sarah admitted, her frustration mounting. But his behavior terrified her. She saw her father physically assault her mother. That's psychological harm. David's lawyer smiled, having successfully planted doubt. He stood and began his cross-examination, attacking Sarah's credibility with surgical precision. Isn't it true, Ms. Mitchell, that you initiated the divorce proceedings, not my client? He asked. Yes, but... And isn't it also true that you've been coaching your daughter to make negative statements about her father? No, I would never. Your Honor, he interrupted, turning to the judge with an expression of concerned sincerity. The witness is becoming emotional and defensive. Isn't that typical behavior of someone who's been caught in a deception? Judge remained impassive. Continue with your questioning, counsel. For the next 40 minutes, David's lawyer systematically dismantled Sarah's testimony. He presented text messages where she'd expressed anger toward David, which he framed as evidence of her vindictiveness. He highlighted inconsistencies in minor details. Sarah had said David came home at 6, but in a previous interview, she'd said it was around 6. Had she changed her story? What else was she misremembering or deliberately falsifying? He brought up her one panic attack, documented in her medical records, suggesting it proved she was mentally unstable. He questioned her financial situation, implying she was motivated by greed in pursuing child support. Each attack was calculated, designed to erode the judge's confidence in Sarah's testimony without ever directly addressing the substance of her allegations. Sarah felt her hands trembling on the witness stand. She could feel tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but she forced them back, remembering Jennifer's instructions. Crying would make her look weak, unstable, unreliable. When David's lawyer finally finished his assault on her credibility, Sarah felt hollowed out, devastated. She'd laid bare her fears, her experiences, her deepest concerns about her daughter's safety, and it had all been twisted and minimized into nothing. Jennifer stood again. Sarah, I want to be clear for the record. In your professional opinion, based on what you've witnessed, do you believe Emma is in danger in her father's care? Sarah looked directly at the judge. Yes, I absolutely do. David has a drinking problem that's getting worse. His anger is unpredictable and frightening. Emma has started having nightmares and behavioral issues since the incidents I've described. She's regressed in her toilet training. She has anxiety when it's time to visit her father. These are classic signs of a traumatized child. But you have no medical documentation of abuse, the judge asked quietly. No, Your Honor. David is very careful. He knows how to hurt people without leaving marks. Objection, David's lawyer called out immediately. That's pure speculation. Sustained, judge said. Ms. Mitchell, stick to facts, not interpretations. The judge turned to David. Mr. Mitchell, would you like to take the stand to respond to these allegations? David stood, and Sarah watched her ex-husband transform himself in real time. His posture changed. He suddenly looked vulnerable and hurt. His expression became one of a man wrongly accused by a vindictive ex-wife. When he was articulate and seemingly thoughtful, presenting himself as a caring father who wanted nothing more than to maintain a strong relationship with his daughter. Your Honor, I love Emma more than anything in the world, he said, his voice wavering with emotion that Sarah knew was completely fabricated. I don't know what I did to make Sarah hate me this much, but these allegations are completely false. I've never laid a hand on her. Yes, I've been stressed about the divorce, and yes, I may have a glass of wine after work sometimes, but I'm not the monster she's portraying. I'm a victim here, a father being kept from his daughter by an angry woman who wants revenge. He looked at the judge with such sincerity that Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She'd fallen for that sincerity once. Many people had. It was his superpower, the ability to make people believe his version of reality, no matter how distorted it actually was. When David's lawyer finished questioning his client, he turned to Jennifer. "No further questions for the witness. I think our case speaks for itself, Your Honor. Without any concrete evidence of abuse, without independent corroboration, and given my client's credible testimony, I believe it's clear that these allegations are nothing more than the fabrications of a scorned ex-wife." The courtroom fell silent. Sarah could feel the case slipping away from her like sand through her fingers. Without Emma's testimony, which everyone agreed was unreliable from a 3-year-old, without medical documentation, without some objective proof of the danger she knew existed, the judge seemed unmoved by her pleas. Jennifer stood. "Your Honor, we have one more witness to call. We'd like to call the court-appointed guardian, Mrs. Hayes, to testify about her observations of the child during today's proceedings." Judge nodded. "Very well, Mrs. Hayes, please take the stand." As Mrs. Hayes made her way to the witness stand, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. Emma's guardian had been observing carefully all day. Surely she'd noticed the change in Emma when Duke arrived. Surely she could testify to the dramatic shift in the child's emotional state, what it might indicate about Emma's comfort and safety needs. Mrs. Hayes took the oath and settled into the witness stand. Her gray hair was pulled back neatly, and her expression was professional but kind. Jennifer approached her. "Mrs. Hayes, in your professional capacity as the court-appointed guardian for Emma Mitchell, what observations have you made regarding the child's emotional and psychological state during today's proceedings?" "Well," Mrs. Hayes began carefully, "Emma has been quite anxious throughout the morning and early afternoon. She's been withdrawn, showing signs of stress and fear. When the dog arrived, however, there was a marked and significant change in her demeanor. She became more alert, more engaged, and noticeably calmer." "What do you make of that change?" Jennifer asked. "Objection," David's lawyer called out. "That's asking the witness to speculate and interpret the child's behavior based on one incident." "Sustained," Judge ruled. "Mrs. Hayes, please limit yourself to observable facts." Mrs. Hayes nodded. "The observable fact is that Emma's anxiety decreased significantly in the presence of the dog and officer. Her verbal communication increased slightly, and her body language became less defensive." "That could simply mean she likes dogs," David's lawyer suggested dismissively. "It doesn't prove anything about her father's parenting or her safety in his care." Judge glanced at the clock on the wall. It showed 4:15 p.m. The judge seemed to be reaching the limits of her patience with this case. "I think we have sufficient information," Judge announced. "We'll conclude the hearing here. I'll take all the testimony, evidence, and observations under advisement and issue my ruling within 48 hours. This court is adjourned." The gavel struck and Sarah felt her heart sink. They were out of time. They were out of tools to convince the judge. Without Emma's own voice, without her testimony, the case felt lost. Sarah glanced at her daughter, sitting with Mrs. Hayes, and then at Duke, who watched Emma with calm, intelligent eyes. Somehow, Sarah knew that what happened next would depend entirely on what Emma herself could communicate. And that terrified her more than anything else. The recess area was a small, quiet corner of the courthouse that had been converted into a waiting space for families involved in legal proceedings. It was painted a soft beige color designed to be calming, though it fell short of actually being comforting. There were a few chairs, a water cooler, and a small table with outdated magazines nobody ever read. It was here, in this unremarkable space, that something extraordinary began to unfold. Mrs. Hayes, the court-appointed guardian, gently guided Emma by the hand toward Officer and Duke. The little girl moved slowly, her pink dress swishing softly with each small step. She had one hand in Mrs. Hayes' grip, and the other clutched a small stuffed rabbit, worn from years of being held and loved. It was Emma's comfort object, the one thing she'd insisted on bringing to the courthouse that morning. Officer sat on one of the uncomfortable courtroom chairs, and Duke settled beside him on the floor, his golden body relaxed but his posture alert. As Emma approached, the dog's tail began to move gently, creating a soft thumping sound against the linoleum floor. It wasn't an excited, manic tail wag, but rather a measured, deliberate acknowledgement, the greeting of one living being to another. "Duke, this is Emma," Officer said softly, his voice warm and welcoming. "Emma, this is Duke. He's a very special dog who likes to listen to people." Emma stopped a few feet away from Duke, suddenly shy. She looked up at Mrs. Hayes, then back at the dog. Her thumb moved toward her mouth, a habit she'd had since infancy that appeared whenever she was nervous or uncertain. Mrs. Hayes gently reached down and moved Emma's hand away from her mouth, not harshly, but with the practiced gentleness of someone experienced with anxious children. "It's okay, sweetheart," Mrs. Hayes encouraged. "Would you like to sit next to Duke?" Emma nodded slowly, though her body language suggested she was still uncertain. Officer gestured to the space beside Duke, and Emma took a tentative step forward. She sat down carefully on the floor, maintaining a few inches of distance between herself and the large dog. For a moment, nothing happened. Emma just sat there looking at Duke, and Duke looked back at her with those impossibly kind, intelligent brown eyes. Then Emma reached out one small hand and gently touched Duke's fur. The moment her fingers made contact with the dog's golden coat, something shifted in the air around them. Officer noticed it immediately, having witnessed this phenomenon countless times before. It was as if Emma had finally found something in this overwhelming, frightening day that made sense to her. Something safe. Something pure and uncomplicated by adult conflict and legal maneuvering. Emma's hand began to move slowly across Duke's side, her fingers threading through the soft fur in gentle, repetitive motions. The anxiety that had been etched into her small face began to soften. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up near her ears all morning, slowly relaxed downward. Her breathing, which Officer could tell had been shallow and rapid, seemed to deepen and slow. Duke remained perfectly still, understanding instinctively that this moment was sacred. The dog had been trained to provide emotional support, but training couldn't capture what was happening here. This was pure connection, two creatures communicating beyond words, beyond the complications of the adult world that surrounded them. Mrs. Hayes, sitting a respectful distance away, pulled out a small notebook and began making detailed observations. She wrote about Emma's posture change, the reduction in visible tension, the way the child's face had transformed from fearful to peaceful. She noted the time 3:15 p.m. and wrote, "Dramatic and sustained change in child's emotional state following interaction with support animal. Most relaxed and present Emma has appeared during entire proceeding." After several minutes of silent connection, Emma seemed to gather courage. She leaned slightly closer to Duke and whispered something that only the dog could hear. Officer strained to make out the words but couldn't quite catch them. Whatever Emma had said, Duke responded by turning his head slightly and gently resting it near the child's lap. It was a gesture of profound comfort, of acceptance, of unconditional affection. Emma's response was immediate and powerful. For the first time since arriving at the courthouse, she smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed her entire face. It was the smile of a child who had found safety, who had found understanding, who had found something in this confusing and frightening experience that made sense. "What did you tell Duke?" Officer asked gently, not to interrogate but to encourage Emma's communication. Emma looked up at him, her eyes bright with a fragile hope. "I told him. I'm scared," she said quietly, her voice small but clear. These were some of the most words she'd spoken all day. Officer nodded with genuine compassion. "That's very brave of you to tell Duke how you feel. Duke understands scared. Duke knows about scared feelings." "Does Duke get scared?" Emma asked, her curiosity piqued despite her fear. Sometimes, Officer said thoughtfully. But Duke learned that when he's scared, he can find safe people to be with, and then the scared feeling gets a little smaller. Not gone, but smaller. Emma seemed to contemplate this wisdom. She looked back down at Duke and continued stroking his fur, her movements more confident now, less tentative. Can I tell Duke more things? Of course, Officer said. Duke is a very good listener. For the next 10 minutes, Emma spoke quietly to Duke. She told him about her favorite songs, about the playground she missed, about a dream she'd had where she was flying. The dog listened with unwavering attention, occasionally turning his head to make eye contact with the child, occasionally shifting his weight slightly to press closer to her. It was a dialogue without words, a conversation of pure emotional presence. Mrs. Hayes continued her careful observations, noting every detail. She saw the way Emma's vocabulary seemed to expand when she was with Duke. The child was speaking in longer sentences, using more complex words than she typically did in stressful situations. She saw the way Emma's breathing had normalized, the way her hands had stopped trembling, the way her entire nervous system seemed to have found equilibrium. At one point, Emma leaned against Duke's side and simply rested her head on the dog's shoulder. Duke remained perfectly still, cradling the child with his presence. Officer could see the moisture in Mrs. Hayes' eyes. The court-appointed guardian was clearly moved by what she was witnessing. "This is remarkable," Mrs. Hayes whispered to Officer. Officer nodded. Children sometimes need to feel safe before they can access their own truth. Duke helps create that safety. It's not magic, it's chemistry, really. When a being feels unconditionally accepted and protected, their nervous system can finally calm down enough to think clearly. At 3:45 p.m., a court officer appeared in the doorway to signal that they needed to return to the courtroom. Emma's face immediately tensed again, the fear creeping back in, but Officer made a decision. "Emma," he said, "Duke is going to be in the courtroom with us. Whenever you need to feel safe, you can remember how it feels right now. Duke will be there." Emma looked at Officer, then back at Duke. "Will Duke stay with me?" "As long as you need him," Officer promised. As they made their way back to the courtroom, Emma walked between Mrs. Hayes and Officer, her hand reaching down occasionally to touch Duke's head as he walked beside her. The transformation was undeniable. The withdrawn, anxious child who had entered the courtroom hours earlier was beginning to emerge, finding her way back to herself. Mrs. Hayes understood in that moment that this case was about to take a turn that nobody expected. Emma had found her anchor. The question now was whether that anchor would be enough to help her speak her truth when it mattered most. Judge watched them return, and even the stern jurist's expression softened slightly as she observed the connection between the child and the dog. She said nothing, but her keen eyes registered everything. The way Emma seemed calmer, more present, more real than she had been hours earlier. The stage was being set for something that would change everything about this custody case. Emma had found her voice through the unconditional presence of a dog. The only question remaining was whether she would use it. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath as Emma, Mrs. Hayes, and Officer returned from the recess area. Judge looked up from her notes and observed the child with careful attention. Even from across the courtroom, the difference in Emma's demeanor was striking. The child who had entered the courthouse that morning withdrawn and terrified now walked with slightly more confidence, her hand resting on Duke's head as they moved toward the back row of seats. Judge set down her pen and folded her hands on the bench before her. She appeared to be making a decision in real time, one that departed from standard courtroom procedure. When everyone had settled, she leaned forward slightly. "I've been considering this case very carefully," Judge began, her voice measured and thoughtful. "There are significant gaps in the evidence presented today. Without clear, substantiated proof of abuse, and without the child's own account of her experiences, I find myself in a difficult position. However, I've been observing the minor child throughout these proceedings, and I've noted a significant change in her emotional state following her interaction with the support animal. Sarah felt her heart begin to race. Was the judge actually going to consider what she'd witnessed? "I would like to take an unconventional approach," Judge continued. "Instead of formal testimony, which would be traumatic and potentially unreliable from a 3-year-old child, I'd like to conduct a gentle, informal questioning session with the minor present. The child will remain with Officer and Duke. Ms., does your client consent to this approach?" Jennifer looked at Sarah, who nodded urgently. "Yes, Your Honor, we consent." "Mr." Judge turned to David's lawyer. David's attorney looked uncomfortable, but recognized that objecting would make him appear unsympathetic to the child's. "We consent, Your Honor, with the caveat that the child's responses be given minimal weight due to her age and suggestibility." "Noted," Judge said. She turned her attention to Emma. "Emma, sweetheart, can you come here for a moment? You can bring Duke with you." Emma looked up at Mrs. Hayes uncertainly. The guardian squeezed her hand reassuringly and stood, guiding Emma toward the judge's bench. Officer stood as well, keeping Duke close beside the child. The dog seemed to understand the importance of this moment, maintaining perfect composure as they approached the seat positioned in front of Judge's elevated bench. Emma sat in a chair that had been positioned so she could comfortably hold Duke's leash while remaining close to the dog. Officer stood a few steps back, far enough to not influence the child's responses, but close enough to provide reassurance through his presence. The courtroom had gone absolutely silent. Even the court reporters seemed to be holding their breath. Judge smiled gently at Emma, and her stern features softened considerably. "Hello, Emma. Do you know who I am?" Emma shook her head silently, her hand still resting on Duke's head. "My name is Judge, and I work here in this building. I help make important decisions about families. Is it okay if I ask you some questions?" Emma nodded, but her body remained tense. Judge glanced at Duke, and it seemed as if the judge understood something crucial. The questions needed to happen in a way that kept the child connected to her source of safety. "Emma, I'm going to ask you some simple questions, okay? There are no wrong answers. I just want to know about you and your feelings. Is that okay?" "Okay," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "Good. First question. Where do you like to play the most?" Emma's face relaxed slightly at this innocuous question. "At the park, with Mommy. We go on the swings." "That sounds like fun," Judge said warmly. "Emma, when you're at the park with your mommy, how do you feel?" "Happy," Emma said more confidently now. "Safe." Sarah felt tears beginning to form but forced them back. The word safe had been spoken, and it mattered. Judge continued gently. "Emma, who makes you laugh?" "Mommy and Mrs. Hayes and Duke," Emma said, glancing down at the dog. She reached down and wrapped her small arm around Duke's neck in a brief hug. "Duke makes you laugh?" Judge asked. "That's wonderful. Emma, I have another question. It might be a little bit harder. Are you ready?" Emma nodded, though her body tensed slightly again. Officer took a small step forward, silently reminding Emma of his presence. Judge took a deep breath. "Emma, I want to know about the different places you go. Sometimes you're with your mommy. Sometimes you're with your daddy. Can you tell me how you feel in both places?" The courtroom held absolutely still. This was the moment. This was the question that everything had been building toward. Emma's hand, which had been relaxed on Duke's head, suddenly gripped the dog's fur more tightly. Judge noticed and waited patiently. She didn't rush the child. She simply allowed space for Emma to process the question and find her response. "With Mommy," Emma said slowly, "I feel safe, happy." "And with Daddy," Judge asked gently, "how do you feel at Daddy's house?" The change in Emma's body language was immediate and profound. Her shoulders tensed. Her breathing became shallow. Her eyes widened slightly, and her hand gripped Duke's fur so tightly that Officer had to suppress a wince on the dog's behalf. Emma looked down at Duke, as if searching for reassurance, for courage, for permission to speak her truth. "Scary," Emma whispered. "Daddy is loud and mean, and he makes Mommy sad." The courtroom erupted in sound, not loud but significant. Sarah's lawyer made notes frantically. David's lawyer stood as if to object but seemed to realize that would make him look even worse. David himself had gone pale, his confident mask slipping for just a moment. But Judge wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her expression intensely focused on the small child before her. "Emma, at Daddy's house, do you feel safe?" Emma shook her head vigorously, her eyes still fixed on Duke. "Do you feel scared?" Emma nodded, and a single tear rolled down her small cheek. Judge let this moment breathe. She allowed the courtroom to absorb what they were hearing. Then she asked one final, crucial question, the question that would become the defining moment of this entire case. "Emma, sweetheart, do you feel safe at Daddy's house?" Emma's body went rigid. Her small face crumpled with emotion. She looked at Duke with an intensity that suggested she was pouring all her fear, all her pain, all her need for safety into that single glance. Then her small arm rose, her finger extended. She pointed directly at Duke, and in a voice that seemed to contain the weight of her entire experience, she spoke two words that would echo through the courtroom and change everything. "Safe dog." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth as a sob escaped her. Jennifer grabbed her arm, squeezing it tightly. The court reporter's fingers had stopped moving. The bailiff stood frozen. Even David seemed to have stopped breathing. Emma had not simply answered the question. In her 3-year-old's way of expressing profound truth, she had compared the safety she felt with Duke to the safety, or complete lack thereof, that she felt at her father's house. She was saying, "I feel as safe with this dog as I feel unsafe with my father." Judge sat back in her chair, visibly moved. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her expression remained professionally composed even as her humanity showed through. "Thank you, Emma," Judge said softly. "You were very brave. You can go back and sit with Mrs. Hayes now." Officer guided Emma back to her seat, and the child immediately curled against Mrs. Hayes, emotionally exhausted. Duke remained close, his presence continuing to provide the anchor that Emma needed. Judge took off her glasses and rubbed her eyes. When she replaced them and looked out at the courtroom, her expression had changed. The skepticism was gone, replaced by clarity and resolve. "I've heard sufficient information to make my determination," Judge announced. "We will reconvene in 30 minutes. I will issue my ruling at that time." As the bailiff called for a brief recess, Sarah watched her daughter sitting with Mrs. Hayes and Duke. Emma was exhausted, but there was something different in her now, a weight lifted, a burden shared. She had spoken her truth, and that truth had been heard. The moment had come and gone, lasting only minutes, but it would resonate through this family story forever. The recess area had transformed into something between a sanctuary and a pressure cooker. Emma sat quietly on Mrs. Hayes' lap, emotionally drained from the intensity of her testimony. Duke remained pressed against the child's leg, his head resting on her knee in a gesture of unwavering support. Officer stood nearby, giving them space while remaining available if needed. The atmosphere was thick, with the weight of what had just transpired. Mrs. Hayes, the court-appointed guardian, worked methodically through her notes, documenting every detail of what she'd witnessed. Her hand moved across the notepad with practiced precision, the pen scratching against paper as she recorded observations that would likely become crucial to the judge's final decision. She wrote, 3:52 p.m. Child provided spontaneous, unprompted response to judicial questioning. When asked directly about feeling safe at paternal residence, child displayed acute stress response, rigid posture, shallow breathing, visible anxiety. Child's response, pointing at support animal and statting, safe dog, appeared to represent metaphorical comparison between safety felt with animal and absence of safety in paternal home. Child's statement was concise, specific, and emotionally authentic. No indication of coaching or suggestion. Child appeared to spontaneously access and communicate genuine emotional truth. Mrs. Hayes paused, pen hovering above the paper. In her 15 years of working with children in custody disputes, she had rarely witnessed something as powerful and unambiguous as what had just occurred. Emma's response hadn't been articulate legal argument. It hadn't been rehearsed talking points. It had been the raw, unfiltered emotional truth of a frightened child reaching for safety and finding it wanting in one place and abundantly present in another. She looked down at Emma, whose eyes had begun to close as exhaustion her small body. The child's hand remained buried in Duke's golden fur, even as sleep crept closer. Mrs. Hayes made additional notes about the child's physical relaxation in the presence of the support animal, about the dramatic contrast between Emma's anxiety during the question about her father's house and her subsequent calm when reunited with Duke. In the courtroom proper, the 30-minute recess had become a pressure cooker of tension and reaction. Sarah sat with Jennifer in the plaintiff's counsel area, her hands shaking as she tried to process what had happened. Her daughter had just told the judge, in her own way, that she didn't feel safe with her father. Those 4 words, or rather, those 2 words spoken about the dog as a proxy for safety itself, had accomplished what no amount of adult testimony had managed to achieve. "That was incredible," Jennifer whispered, her professional composure cracking slightly to reveal genuine emotion. "Do you understand what just happened? Emma essentially told the judge that she feels safer with a dog than with her father. That's not something a judge can ignore. That's not something any judge in the country could ignore." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. Tears streamed down her face, not the controlled, careful tears she'd been holding back all day, but genuine, overwhelming tears of relief and vindication and residual fear. She'd been right all along. Her instincts about Emma's safety had been correct. And now, finally, someone had heard it. Someone had listened not to David's charm or legal maneuvering, but to the voice of her daughter. Across the courtroom, the dynamics were starkly different. David sat rigidly in his chair, his perfectly maintained composure shattered. His lawyer leaned close to him, speaking in low, urgent tones. Sarah could see the anger flashing across David's face, could see the moment when he seemed to realize that his carefully constructed narrative had crumbled. His hands clenched into fists on the table, and for just an instant the mask slipped completely, and what showed underneath was rage. Pure, unfiltered rage at being exposed by a 3-year-old. David's lawyer, appeared equally shaken. He'd built his entire case on the premise that Sarah was a vindictive ex-wife making false accusations, that David was a loving father being wrongfully separated from his daughter. Emma's statement had obliterated that narrative. The lawyer's jaw was clenched, and he kept glancing toward the judge's empty bench as if searching for some legal loophole, some procedural objection that might undo what had just been said. In a quiet corner of the courthouse hallway, Officer stood near a window, allowing himself a moment of reflection. He'd been working with emotional support animals in legal proceedings for 5 years, and he'd witnessed countless moments of children finding their courage through connection with animals. But what had happened today transcended typical emotional support work. Officer understood something that others might miss. Emma hadn't simply felt comfortable talking because of Duke's presence, though that was certainly part of it. Emma had used Duke as a mirror. By comparing her sense of safety with the dog to her lack of safety with her father, she'd made a profound psychological statement. She'd identified with the dog's unconditional acceptance and protection, and implicitly rejected the unsafe, unpredictable environment her father provided. Officer reached down and stroked Duke's head, the dog's eyes meeting his with the serene wisdom of an animal who had just completed important work. "You did good, buddy," Officer whispered. "You helped that little girl find her voice." Back in the recess area, Mrs. Hayes added one final note to her documentation. 3:58 p.m. Child has fallen asleep in guardian's arms while maintaining physical contact with support animal. Child's body language suggests complete emotional and physical safety in current environment. Previous anxiety and hypervigilance have been replaced with genuine relaxation. Recommend continued support animal presence during any additional judicial contact with minor. Mrs. Hayes looked up at Officer and made a decision. She would recommend in the strongest possible terms that the judge give significant weight to Emma's statement. Not as formal testimony. It would be inappropriate to treat a 3-year-old's words as legal evidence in the traditional sense, but as a profound indicator of the child's emotional and psychological state. And that emotional and psychological state was the clearest possible evidence of safety or danger in a custodial environment. At 4:22 p.m., a court officer appeared to signal that the court would reconvene in 10 minutes. Mrs. Hayes gently roused Emma from her sleep, and the child opened her eyes slowly, momentarily confused about where she was. But as awareness returned, Emma's eyes immediately found Duke, and the dog seemed to understand that the child needed reassurance. Duke pressed closer, his head resting against Emma's shoulder. "Time to go back to the courtroom, sweetheart," Mrs. Hayes said gently. "Judge is going to make her decision now." Emma nodded wordlessly, her hand gripping Duke's collar as they stood. Officer fell into step beside them, and together they made their way back toward the courtroom. As they walked through the courthouse corridors, Sarah emerged from the plaintiff's waiting area, and her eyes immediately found her daughter. Emma looked at her mother and held out her free hand, the one not holding Duke's collar. Sarah moved quickly, taking that small hand in hers, squeezing gently. "I told the judge," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah knelt down, bringing her face level with her daughter's. "You were so brave, baby, so incredibly brave." When they entered the courtroom, Judge was already seated at the bench, her expression grave but thoughtful. The judge's eyes moved between Sarah and Emma, and something in her gaze suggested she had come to an important understanding about what this case was truly about. It wasn't about legal technicalities or courtroom procedure. It was about a little girl's safety, and it was about whose care would allow Emma to feel the way she felt right now, secure, protected, loved, and free from fear. Judge looked directly at Emma, who sat with Duke close beside her, and gave the child the smallest nod. An acknowledgement, a validation, a promise that what Emma had expressed would not be ignored. The moment of truth was approaching. The judge was about to speak, and everything would change. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Judge prepared to deliver her ruling. The judge sat motionless for several long moments, her eyes closed as if she were gathering her thoughts, accessing her judicial wisdom, and perhaps silently acknowledging the weight of the decision she was about to announce. When she finally opened her eyes and looked out at the assembled courtroom, her expression was one of clarity and resolve. "This has been one of the most challenging cases I've presided over in recent memory," Judge began, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom like a proclamation. Not because the evidence presented by either side was particularly compelling, but because what I witnessed today went beyond the conventional framework of custody litigation. What I saw was a child communicating her deepest emotional truth in the most authentic way a 3-year-old can. Sarah felt Jennifer squeeze her arm. She didn't dare breathe, didn't dare move, as if any disturbance might somehow change the trajectory of the judge's words. Judge continued. The plaintiff, Miss Sarah Mitchell, presented allegations of abuse and unsafe conditions in the defendant's home. The defendant, Mr. David Mitchell, presented a counter-narrative suggesting these allegations were fabrications of a vindictive ex-spouse. Both presented witnesses and documentation. Both made compelling arguments within their respective frameworks. The judge paused, adjusting her glasses. However, throughout these proceedings, I observed the minor child, Emma Mitchell. I observed her anxiety, her fear, her withdrawn demeanor. I observed the dramatic and sustained change in her emotional state following her interaction with the emotional support animal. Most significantly, I observed her response when asked directly about her sense of safety in each parental home. David's lawyer began to shift in his seat, as if preparing to object, but Judge raised her hand slightly. "Let me finish." When asked if she felt safe at her father's house, the child displayed acute signs of distress. She became tense, her breathing became shallow, her eyes widened. Her response, pointing to the support animal while stating, "Safe dog," was not a legal argument. It was not coached testimony. It was the raw, unfiltered emotional truth of a child expressing that she experiences safety with an animal but not with her father. In my 23 years on the bench, I have rarely witnessed such a clear, unambiguous expression of a child's emotional reality. Sarah felt tears beginning to stream down her face again. This was it. This was the judge acknowledging what Sarah had been trying to communicate all along. "While I recognize that a 3-year-old statement cannot constitute formal testimony in the traditional legal sense," Judge continued, "I also recognize that child development experts universally agree that young children's emotional responses provide crucial indicators of their psychological and physical safety." Emma's response today was not ambiguous. It was not confusing. It was profoundly clear. The judge set down her pen and folded her hands on the bench. "Therefore, I am issuing the following ruling." The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Even the slight sounds of movement and breathing seemed to pause. "Full legal and physical custody of Emma Mitchell is hereby awarded to the plaintiff, Sarah Mitchell," Judge announced. "The defendant, David Mitchell, shall have visitation rights on a supervised basis only." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth as a sob escaped her. Jennifer grabbed her, pulling her into a tight embrace. Around them, she could hear the sound of her own crying, the scratch of the court reporter's pen, the shuffle of papers as David's lawyer began frantically gathering his materials. But Judge wasn't finished. She continued with the additional terms of her ruling, her voice steady and authoritative. "Visitation for Mr. Mitchell shall be limited to 4 hours per week, supervised by a court-approved monitor. These visits shall take place in a neutral environment, prior to any unsupervised visitation being considered, and I want to be clear that unsupervised visitation is not being granted at this time. Mr. Mitchell must complete the following. First, a comprehensive psychological evaluation conducted by a court-approved evaluator. Second, enrollment in and completion of an approved parenting program focused on child development, anger management, and trauma-informed parenting practices. Third, completion of a substance abuse evaluation and, if necessary, treatment program. David's face had gone completely white. His hands gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. His lawyer was whispering urgently to him, but David didn't seem to be listening. "Furthermore," Judge continued, "I am recommending that Emma receive trauma-informed therapy to process her experiences. The costs of this therapy shall be covered equally by both parents, though Ms. Mitchell, as the custodial parent, shall have the authority to select the therapist." The judge paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a tone of something deeper than judicial pronouncement. It was personal conviction. "I want to be explicit about the role that the emotional support animal played in these proceedings," Judge said, looking toward Officer and Duke. Officer and Duke provided a service that transcended typical courtroom protocol. By creating an environment in which this child felt safe enough to communicate her emotional reality, they helped pierce through the legal maneuvering and conflicting narratives to reveal the actual truth, that this child does not feel safe in her father's care. Officer, Duke, and the Community Support Animal Program deserve commendation for their work in family court proceedings. Officer inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. Duke, sitting calmly beside Emma, seemed to sense the moment's significance and pressed closer to the child. Judge turned her attention back to the parties. "I want to address Mr. Mitchell directly. I'm not making this ruling because I believe you are an inherently bad person. I'm making this ruling because your daughter has communicated, through her emotional response and her own words, that she does not feel safe in your care. Whether that is due to anger management issues, substance abuse, or other factors is irrelevant to the central question before this court. Where will this child's safety and be best served? The answer, based on the evidence presented today and the child's own emotional testimony, is with her mother. David seemed to want to stand to object, to say something in his defense, but his lawyer grabbed his arm firmly, keeping him seated. The lawyer understood that any outburst at this point would only confirm the judge's concerns. However, Judge continued, addressing both parents, I want to be clear that this is not a permanent ruling. If Mr. Mitchell completes the required programs, if psychological evaluation indicates improvement, if the supervised visitation proceeds without incident, we can revisit this determination in 1 year. The goal is not to punish Mr. Mitchell, but to ensure the safety of the minor child while providing opportunity for improvement and eventual restoration of a healthier relationship. Sarah felt something shift inside her, not complete joy but genuine hope. The judge was giving David a path forward, but not at Emma's expense. The priority was clear. Emma's safety came first. Ms. Mitchell, Judge said, looking directly at Sarah, you have been awarded full custody of Emma. I encourage you to support reasonable contact between father and daughter, provided it remains in the supervised context I've outlined. Children benefit from having relationships with both parents when it is safe to do so. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. She understood. She would support Emma's relationship with her father, but only when Emma was safe. Only when David had done the work necessary to change his behavior. This court is adjourned, Judge said, striking her gavel. The sound echoed through the courtroom with finality and authority. The courtroom erupted in movement. Sarah immediately stood and turned toward Emma, moving across the space that separated them. Mrs. Hayes stood as well, understanding that this moment belonged to mother and daughter. Sarah reached Emma and scooped her into her arms, holding her daughter tightly as both of them wept, Sarah with overwhelming relief, Emma with the release of the fear that had been pressing down on her all day. Emma's arms wrapped around her mother's neck and she whispered, "Mommy, we can go home now." "Yes, baby," Sarah breathed, tears streaming down her face. "We're going home now, we're safe now." Officer watched the scene with quiet satisfaction. He guided Duke over to where Sarah and Emma stood, and the child reached out to touch the dog's head one final time. "Thank you," Sarah said to Officer, her voice breaking. "Thank you for everything." Officer smiled. "Duke is the one who deserves the thanks. He helped Emma find her voice. That's all we wanted." As Sarah held her daughter and felt Duke's gentle presence beside them, she understood that they had just lived through one of the most significant moments of their lives. Justice hadn't just been served. It had been delivered by a 3-year-old girl, a golden retriever, and the courage of one mother who had refused to give up. 3 weeks had passed since Judge ruling, and the world felt fundamentally different to Sarah Mitchell. She stood in the kitchen of their new apartment, a modest 2-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood near Green Hills, watching her daughter through the window as Emma played in the small backyard with a rubber ball. The transformation in her daughter's demeanor was still almost unbelievable to witness. Emma moved with a lightness that had been absent for months. Her laughter, when it came, was genuine and unguarded. She still had moments of anxiety. Trauma didn't simply disappear with a court order, but they were becoming fewer and further between. Doctor, a trauma-informed child psychologist, had begun working with Emma twice a week, helping the child process her experiences and rebuild her sense of safety in the world. Sarah had kept the apartment intentionally small and simple. After the elaborate, tension-filled house she'd shared with David, she wanted something cozy, manageable, and entirely theirs. Every room in this apartment felt like healing. The walls were painted soft colors. Natural light streamed through windows that looked out onto trees and grass. There were no sharp edges, no expensive furnishings that couldn't be touched. This was a space designed around what children needed: safety, comfort, and room to grow. The first week after the ruling had been dominated by practical matters. Sarah had transferred Emma's enrollment to a different preschool, one closer to their new home and free from any association with David's influence. She'd updated Emma's medical records, her school files, her insurance information. Each administrative task had felt like another layer of protection, another declaration that they were moving forward, building a new life. But the most significant change had come from an unexpected source. Officer had called 3 days after the ruling. He wanted to know how Emma was doing, and whether the child might like to spend some time with Duke in a casual, non-official capacity. What had begun as a simple question had evolved into a weekly ritual that Emma now anticipated with genuine joy. Every Saturday morning at 10 a.m., Officer would arrive at Sarah and Emma's apartment building with Duke. The three of them, Emma, Officer, and Duke, would spend 2 hours together at Centennial Park, one of Nashville's most beautiful green spaces. They would walk along the paths, sit by the water, and Emma would talk to Duke about her week, her feelings, her observations about the world around her. Sarah watched this unfold from a respectful distance, understanding that this connection between her daughter and the dog served a purpose that extended far beyond the courtroom. Duke had become a bridge away for Emma to process her experiences and rebuild her sense of trust in the world. Officer had explained it to Sarah during one of their conversations. Duke isn't therapy, but Duke facilitates healing. Your daughter found her voice with Duke. Now she's using that voice to talk about everything, her fears, her hopes, her dreams. That's what we want to encourage. 4 weeks after the ruling, Sarah sat in her living room with Mrs. Hayes, the court-appointed guardian who had become something of a friend and mentor. Mrs. Hayes had requested this meeting to provide her final report to the court, but she'd also come to check on Emma personally. She'd brought coloring books and a gift certificate to Emma's favorite ice cream shop. Emma's doing remarkably well, Mrs. Hayes said, reviewing her notes. Her anxiety levels have decreased significantly. She's speaking more, engaging more with her environment. The trauma is still there. It will take time to fully process, but she's demonstrating remarkable resilience. She's been asking about her father, Sarah said quietly, not in a way that suggests she wants to go back to him, but more confused, I think. She doesn't understand why he hurt her or why she can't see him unsupervised. Mrs. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. That's age-appropriate. She's beginning to develop more sophisticated emotional understanding. She's starting to grasp that people can do harmful things while still being people she should have some connection to. That's actually a sign of healthy development, as difficult as it is. Emma herself had started the first supervised visit with her father 2 weeks after the ruling. Sarah had remained just outside the glass partition at the Family Service Center, watching carefully. The visit had lasted only 90 minutes, and Emma had cried when it ended, not from fear, but from the confusion of conflicting emotions. She loved her father in the way children do, but she also remembered being afraid of him. Those two realities couldn't quite fit together in her young mind. David had appeared chastened during the visit. His charm had been muted, his demeanor subdued. Whether he genuinely understood the impact of his behavior or was simply performing for the court monitor remained to be seen. But he had completed his initial psychological evaluation, and he'd enrolled in the mandated parenting program. Judge had made clear that progress on these fronts would be carefully monitored. 6 weeks after the ruling, something remarkable happened. A local Nashville news station picked up the story of Emma's case. They'd learned about Duke's role in the proceedings through contacts at the courthouse, and they recognized the human interest angle immediately. The story aired on the evening news. Police dog helps silent child find her voice in custody battle. The segment was respectful and well-produced. It included interviews with officer discussing the role of emotional support animals in family court proceedings. It included judge speaking carefully about the case while protecting Emma's privacy, discussing the importance of understanding children's emotional states. It included footage of Emma playing with Duke in the park, though Emma's face had been obscured to protect her identity. The response had been overwhelming. The Nashville Police Department's Community Support Animal Program received dozens of calls from people wanting to support their work. Other courts across Tennessee began inquiring about implementing similar programs. The story was picked up by national news outlets, and Duke became something of a minor celebrity. For Sarah, the publicity had been bittersweet. She valued the attention it brought to emotional support animals in legal proceedings, but she also wanted to protect Emma's privacy and allow her to heal away from public scrutiny. Officer had been sensitive to this, declining most requests for follow-up interviews and redirecting focus to the broader issue of trauma-informed courtroom practices rather than the specifics of Emma's case. 8 weeks after the ruling, on a beautiful Saturday morning in late November, Sarah sat on a bench in Centennial Park watching Emma and Officer and Duke. Fall leaves crunched under their feet as they walked along the path. Emma was talking animatedly about something she'd learned at preschool. Her vocabulary had expanded noticeably since the court proceedings, and Duke walked beside her with his usual calm presence. A woman approached Sarah on the bench, and Sarah initially tensed, uncertain if this was someone from the media or a stranger. But the woman quickly explained she was a family law attorney working on a case involving a young child. She'd seen the news story about Emma and Duke. "I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to consult with my firm," the attorney said. "We're trying to advocate for more courts to use emotional support animals in family proceedings. Your daughter's case is a powerful example of how this can help children access their own truth." Sarah glanced toward Emma, who was laughing at something Duke had done. Her daughter was healing. Her daughter was finding her way back to herself. And the story of that healing, the story of how a golden retriever had helped a frightened 3-year-old find her voice, was now helping other children. "I'd like to think about that," Sarah said carefully. "But I want to make sure whatever I do protects Emma's and privacy above all else." The attorney nodded with understanding. "Of course, your daughter comes first, always." As Sarah watched Emma continue her walk with Officer and Duke, she reflected on how much had changed in just 8 weeks. She had her daughter. They had safety, stability, and a home filled with love. Emma was healing, growing, learning that the world could be a safe place. And they had Duke, a golden retriever whose presence had changed the trajectory of their entire lives. That evening, after Officer had taken Duke home, Emma sat on Sarah's lap as they watched the sunset from their apartment balcony. The child was quiet, contemplative, her hand wrapped around a small stuffed dog that looked remarkably similar to Duke. It was a gift Officer had brought her last week. "Mommy," Emma said softly. "Yes, baby." "Is Duke sad that he can't stay with us all the time?" Sarah smiled, feeling the weight of her daughter's growing empathy and understanding. "No, sweetheart, Duke is happy when he's helping people, and he knows he helped us. He helped us find our way back to each other." Emma nodded thoughtfully, and Sarah held her daughter close, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breathing, the warmth of her small body against hers. This was safety. This was home. This was what they'd been fighting for all along. Outside, the Nashville night settled in around them, peaceful, quiet, and full of possibilities. A new beginning had arrived, not with fanfare or drama, but gently, quietly, in the presence of a child who had found her voice and a mother who would spend the rest of her life protecting it.